Hi, my name is Kiru, and today we're going to talk about ending violence against refugee and non status immigrant women. The purpose of this talk is to explore the nature of violence against refugee, non status, and immigrant women. And we will also be looking at best practices for social workers to end violence against these communities. Before we get started, we should talk about key definitions. When I say non-status, I mean someone without legal immigration status, who lacks a permanent resident status, who came to Canada with a temporary visa or temporary work permit and stayed in Canada beyond the expiration of their visas and or permits. And this includes women who made refugee claims that were rejected or decided to stay in Canada as illegal immigrants. Refugee, a person who is forced to flee their ancestral home because of factors including persecution, war, and other factors. These individuals flee their ancestral homes, countries, and request asylum in other countries that accept refugee claimants. An immigrant is a person who has settled permanently in a country. In Canada, immigrants either have permanent residency or citizenship. So, what are the causes of violence against immigrant, non status, and refugee women? Often it's a result of racism, it's a result of immigrant related abuse. Risk factors include language barriers, a lack of sanctuary, attitudes that condone violence, a lack of family and support systems, post migration strain, and trauma. So most immigrants, if we would talk about the first risk factors, we would talk about how most immigrants, refugees, and people without status are expected by Canadian citizens and the government to acclimate to Canadian society in order to make ends meet. People of color who migrate from other countries must uphold Canadian values, read white values, to get citizenship, access to living wage jobs, and find housing. When immigrant, refugee, or non-status women call the police to get away from violent partners, they often do so because it is their last resort. However, when immigrant, refugee, non-status women call the police and/or intimate partner organizations for help, these organizations and institutions often deploy dominant discourses that further marginalize these women rather than actually help them leave violent situations. These dominant discourses tend to see the violence that immigrant, refugee, and non-status women face as cultural problems rather than as issues of structural inequality. The police, service providers, and media often portray immigrant, refugee, and non-status women as victims of their own communities because apparently, quote unquote, they practice backward cultural practices and gender roles. This kind of racist ideology around racialized folks or immigrant, non-status, and refugee women keeps these women subjugated. In reality, however, immigrant, refugee, and non status women experience violence in their homes and in the public life. This is a result of the intersection of racism and sexism. Gendered violence and racism constrain immigrant, refugee, and non status women in many ways in Canada. Some examples of this include publicly abusing women wearing a hijab, underpaying migrant women, domestic helpers, having a high proportion of immigrant and refugee women in low paying jobs and precarious work, and racially derogatory or sexually derogatory harassment against immigrant, non-status, and refugee women. All these examples make refugee and non-status women susceptible to intimate partner violence and also make it difficult for them to leave violent partners. The lack of social and political support for these women leave them isolated and subjugated to multiple and interesting forms of social and political violence. Immigrant, refugee, and non-status women become reliant on their abusive partners because their socioeconomic position makes it difficult for them to be independent from their partners. Race-based discrimination against immigrant women make it difficult for her to not only access intervention and prevention programs, but also social networks, social services, and also use support services in general. So the next risk factor is immigrant-related abuse. Immigrant, refugee, and non-status women experience very specific immigrant-related abuse. This abuse usually happens in the form of threats or violence by their intimate partners that place immigrant, refugee, and non-status women at risk of state violence if they do not remain under the control of their violent partners. For instance, refugee claimants survivors often experience coercive control by intimate partners. Abusers tell refugee claimants that they can only receive status if they remain in the abusive relationship. In reality, however, refugee claimants can separate their refugee claim from their abuser during the refugee process. There is a lack of knowledge about the refugee immigration process and their rights. This leaves refugee, immigrant, and sometimes non-status women at risk of more violence. Moreover, abusers may prevent immigrant refugee women from learning French and English that is required for them to get better jobs. This leaves refugee, immigrant, and non-status women economically dependent on their abusers. Even more alarming is the nature of violence against non-status women. The lack of status constrains non-status survivors. They are reluctant to leave their abusive partners or go to the authorities because they fear being deported, losing their jobs, and or losing their children. Immigrant, refugee, and non-status women also experience heightened risk for violence because abusers conceal immigration documents and other important documents from women that prevent them from leaving. Survivors from these communities also fear that if they report their abusers to the authorities, it would mean that their partner would be deported, and then by extension, they would experience deportation. Finally, the lack of status may prevent survivors from being eligible for social services. These social services may be important for survivors' safety. For example, a social assistance can help immigrant, refugee, and non-status women leave abusive partners, but because the lack of status means no social security, often these women are forced to remain in abusive situations. Another risk factor is language barriers. It puts immigrant, refugee, and non-status women at higher risk of violence. When intimate personal violence services are not provided with interpretation or translation services to survivors, survivors are hesitant to report abuse or leave their abusive partners. Moreover, language barriers contribute to communication issues such as information gaps that are important for risk assessments and safety planning. The lack of appropriate language services can also complicate help-seeking behaviors of these communities because immigrant, refugee, and non-status women also may have different definitions, different ideas about the nature and impact of IPV they face. It is when IPV organizations fail to understand the social or cultural context of the survivor, they may fail to eliminate the risk of violence that these communities face. There's also a lack of sanctuary. That's another risk factor that contributes to violence against immigrant, refugee, and non-status women. So, immigrant, refugee, and non-status women who lack access to sanctuary from violent intimate partner relationships are at a higher risk of violence. This lack of sanctuary is described as divorce restrictions or living with the husband's extended family or societies that prohibit immigrant, refugee, and non-status women from gaining sanctions against abusive partner. Often, and if immigrant, non-status, and refugee women originate from their ancestral homes where there's no sanctions against perpetrators, they can have this idea that when they go to a new place or they migrate to a new place that they would have similar lack of restrictions against their perpetrators. This can be true for some countries, and it can be different, but there's a lack of information about what are violations against a woman's rights in relation to violence against women for survivors. So because they don't have access to this information and because of their precarious immigration status, often survivors from these communities stay with their abusers. Um, Also, attitudes that condone violence against immigrant, refugee, and non-status women also contribute to violence against these communities. So, research points to the fact that immigrant, refugee, and non-status women are at a higher risk of violence because they may contend with traditional gender norms or cultural beliefs that accept violence against women in their respective communities. In fact, immigrant women report higher perceived social and legal risks of leaving violent situations than non-immigrant women. Moreover, immigrant, refugee, and non-status women also reported higher rates of isolation than non-immigrant women. Often this isolation is due to the fact that sometimes when immigrant, refugee, and non-status women do go to the community for help, they shame and blame for speaking openly about their intimate partner violence. One reason for is that community members of immigrant communities fear racism and discrimination by the dominant society. On the other hand, immigrant communities often prescribe to traditional gender roles that ask women to remain committed to their partners in marriages. This is otherwise also known as patriarchal norms that immigrant women, non-status women, and refugee women are asked to respect in relation to male dominance. So they're expected to adhere to rigid gender roles. So gender-based violence against these communities is accepted because of specific gender roles, and this means that community members expect women to respect men, not to express disagreement of cultural norms, and accept that they are property of male partners. These traditional gender roles and ideologies, however, cut across race, culture, and ethnicity, and they become heightened when immigrant communities face intercultural conflict in places that they migrate to. Another risk factor is a lack of familiar or other support. So, immigrant, refugee, and non-status women are at a heightened risk of violence when they lack familial, social, and communal social supports. Often, immigrant, refugee, and non-status women leave behind important family networks once they migrate to places like Canada. The lack of familial support, compounded by the lack of support from in-laws, can contribute to a higher risk of violence. Moreover, studies undertaken in the United States show that Latina immigrant women often face a higher risk of violence when there's no children in the family. In contrast, in other cultures, such as the Tamil community in Canada, the presence of children prevent immigrant, refugee, and non-status women from leaving abusive homes because they need to feed, clothe, and shelter their family, and they can only do this with the support of or the financial support of abusers, and financial support is sometimes higher than personal safety from violence for some people in the Tamil community. Another, and this is going to be our final risk factor for this presentation, is post-migration strain and trauma. Immigrant, refugee, and non-status women are at heightened risk of violence because of post-immigration strain and trauma. Prior to migration, many of these women experience deleterious socioeconomic conditions that force them to leave their ancestral homes. Their lived realities in their ancestral homes and the process of migration can lead to unresolved trauma as a result of pre-migration war and poverty and political discrimination in their homes. Once they arrive in places like Canada, this unresolved pre-migration trauma can be exacerbated by other changes that come with migration. These changes include power imbalances between partners in new geographical places, change in social networks and supports, loss of culture, family structures, and community leaders, change in gender roles and responsibilities, geographic isolation, economic insecurity because places like Canada do not recognize foreign professional educational credentials, and other stress related to migration, such as acculturation pressure. Immigrant, refugee, and non-status women face tremendous cultural and socioeconomic barriers as a result of migration. The trauma of migration can contribute to poor self-image and poor mental health. The latter and former keep immigrant and refugee women from disclosing violence and also leaving their abusive partners because they do not have the support they require to navigate their immigrant lives, let alone the violence they experience from their partners. So, what are the best practices that we as social workers can deploy to support immigrant, refugee, and non-status women who experience violence? Well, one of them is to provide trauma-informed services. So it's important that all intimate partner service providers that support immigrant, refugee, and non-status survivors of violence deploy trauma-informed services for all their survivors. This means providing services that assume that all clients who come through the agency have faced violence. This also means for not forcing survivors to disclose their history of violence without access to appropriate counseling and emotional supports in place. A trauma-informed approach must also take into consideration the fact that immigrant, refugee, and non-status women may have experienced multiple trauma as a result of pre-migration and post-migration stress. These traumas must be screened for because they can constrain survivors and make them susceptible for more violence. Finally, trauma-informed approach will ensure that when service providers create safety, they do so with the intention of creating safe spaces for immigrant, refugee, non-status women to connect with members of their community so they can heal from multiple traumas they have faced and or are currently facing. This can mean referring clients to spaces that are actively promoting healing of immigrant, refugee, and non-status survivors of violence through community organizing, through art, cooking, and other activities. These spaces are important not only for healing purposes, but also because they allow for these populations to form relationships without folks outside of their with folks outside of their abusive partners. This staves off isolation and also contributes to more disclosures of abuse and access to supports. Social workers can also provide survivor-centric services. So when working with immigrant, refugee, and non-status survivors, it's important to emphasize the survivor's autonomy and supporting them in making informed decisions about their life. This means giving them the opportunity to express themselves freely. It also means empowering them by giving them information about their rights and different resources that are available to them to help them become more self-confident, build self-esteem and self-worth. Survivor-centric services include providing women with food, legal assistance, access to sustainable education, driving classes, affordable housing, phones, financial assistance, and a safe place to go away from their abuser. Immigrant, refugee, and non-status women should be given information about their rights and the legal system. So social workers must help immigrant, refugee, and non-status women navigate various legal systems, including immigration services and criminal law support. Finally, safety planning must be an ongoing process for immigrant, refugees, and non-status women. These safety plans must address short-term and long-term safety needs. So this means doing wellness checks on these women, call them to make sure that they have a community to go to, help them with community referrals. It also means connecting them with a safe community leaders from their community, and then this is really important because it allows isolated survivors to connect with culture community if they want to, and that's really important for their healing. They should also educate the community about what's important for survivors when they leave abusive situations. So outreach programs and awareness programs can help facilitate this. Finally, naming the murder of immigrant and refugee women as femicide is an important aspect of supporting immigrant, refugee, and non-status survivors of women. Especially in the cases of deaths of immigrant, refugee, and non-status women, it should be referred to as femicide. This is important because it helps to frame their histories with intimate partner violence as part of a gender-based violence that all women face, rather than a problem of cultural practices of these communities. This practice of recognizing death of immigrant, refugee, and non is important because the term femicide does not separate women and girls into distinct groups based on race, culture, and religion, and rejects the notion that the West is not patriarchal. In other words, using femicide to refer to murder and refugee and immigrant women allows groups to be recognized important groups and individuals that must be protected in the quest to fight and end violence against women everywhere. So this is good for prevention and supporting of these survivors. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you.